Shall we go?
Okay, okay, we can go. Yeah.
Okay. So they have the American company Bell Laboratory have been very welcoming. What, in your idea, has motivated this warm welcoming? Was your thesis so up level, or did you had any acquaintance with some of these people?
Oh, yes, of course, I knew by reputation that the transistor was invented there, and I knew those names Shockley, Badin, and Bratton. And most of all, I knew the inventor of information theory, Claude Shannon, and I knew some of the mathematicians there by reputation, by reading their books or papers. So that's why, of course, I wanted to join Bell Labs because there were so many famous people there.
And I didn't know that you met Shannon.
Yes, I did meet him, not on the first day, but later I did meet Claude Shannon. Yes.
What do you think of his work actually? Where will
Well, I mean, Shannon's work is, of course, absolutely unique. He, in inventing what he called communication theory and what everybody else calls information theory, it's really a theory about communication and not a theory about information. Um, this mathematical work, but Shannon was an electrical engineer. He was not a mathematician. And in his mathematical proofs, there were some errors that were later corrected by American and Russian mathematicians. But that's not the main point, whether you make a mistake or not. You have the idea of what it means communication theory. And now you make some mistakes in the theory. Nobody knows about this, but they were corrected by, as I said, Russian and American, real mathematicians.
Okay, so to what task have you been affected when you entered the Bell Laboratories?
What I was asked to do,
Yes.
well, as I said, I was already somewhat famous through my work in concert hall acoustics, and they asked me to, if I wanted to continue this work. But being a student and not knowing better, I thought all the problems in concert hall acoustics were solved. And I thought it would be better for me to do something, work in an area that was of more immediate interest to the telephone company, to Bell. It was then called Bell Telephone Laboratories. So I picked speech, language, linguistics as my field in 1954 when I first joined Bell Labs. And it has stayed with me, speech research, uh, um, well, for the next 50 years.
When you say that to you the room acoustics problems were solved, to what solution are you making allusion?
I'm making allusion to the fact that in my thesis I had discovered that the distribution of resonances in concert halls and other acoustical spaces are completely random, which people didn't know. And also, I'd made a theory of sound transmission in large rooms. It's called the parameters or something of the frequency transmission in large rooms. And I solved that problem too. And I thought this was it. I mean, I simply didn't know enough about all the problems in concert hall acoustics. But then, as a young student, I thought I'd solved it all, which wasn't true at all.
The Bell Laboratories has had quite a few auditoriums and recording studios. Who was in charge of these recording facilities?
Well, the director of acoustics research, this was the man who interviewed me in London and then later imported me to the United States and met me in this big limousine and so forth. So he was in charge of all this work. Of course, uh, s- uh, 9 years later, I became myself a director of acoustics research. Then I was in charge of all this. We also had a free space room, an anechoic chamber, the largest in the world. In other words, a room in which there are no echoes, in which you can make acoustical measurements. For example, the radiation patterns of musical instruments, how they radiate different frequencies in different directions, and so forth. And so th- we had these spaces, yes.
Did you perform in this anechoic room the famous recording of the London Symphony Orchestra with the Jupiter Symphony?
Yeah, these recordings for which we obtained from London were played back in this free space room, officially called anechoic chamber without echoes. And of course, later when I came back to Göttingen 15 years later, we played them in the Göttingen anechoic room.
But the recording that you used after that for your work with Attal and Gottlieb was made in Göttingen. Do you remember that? Or was it made in Bell Laboratories?
Yeah, which recording or experiment are you referring to?
The recording that has been used for your two students, Attal and Gottlieb.
Ah, okay. The original recording, was made in London by, I think it was called the London Chamber Orchestra or whatever, uh, in a reverberation-free space in London. And then my students, Gottlob and Seebasse, played back this recording in 22 different concert halls in Europe and in the USA. And now, these recordings are from 22 different concert halls, about 10 different seats in each concert hall, were then played back in the Göttingen anechoic space to acoustically recreate these different concert halls in one place, namely here in Göttingen.
Okay, we'll be back on this work
Yeah.
later. Okay, so let's go back to your work. So you start working on the voice recognition, voice analysis, the way of
Yes.
getting voice into information. This is what you have been doing.
Yeah. My main interest in working with human speech was speech compression. In other words, to reduce the bandwidth or the bit rate, the information rate of speech. And that's the work I started in 1954, and but it really became of great interest only in the 1980s and 90s. We wouldn't have cell phones where everybody can talk without speech compression. We couldn't have all this speech on the internet. Speech, not written text, but speech without speech compression. Everybody knows who uses a digital camera that images, pictures are compressed by JPEG and other methods. Pictures are always compressed, although you couldn't send them efficiently over the internet as email and so forth. And but what most people don't know, that whenever you listen to speech on your cell phone or on the internet, it is not the original speech. It is speech analyzed and then resynthesized inside the cell phone or inside your computer when you listen to speech over the internet.
And at the time, did you digitize the voice signal to try to some compression, digital compression?
Yes, that's right. The first time, of course, this was done was in 1942. The original invention on which my work was based by someone called Homer Dudley, was done in 1928, which most people don't know, because it was only exhibited at the New York World's Fair in 1939. And then this invention called vocoder, for voice coder, was used for the first time in a digital secret telephone link between Churchill in London and Roosevelt in Washington. And in order to be able to completely encrypt this speech between Churchill and Roosevelt, it had to be digital. Even then, in order to really encrypt a speech signal, you have to first digitize it, and then you can encrypt it. And when you digitize it, uh, you can't just transmit it over the Atlantic, certainly not in those days. You had to compress it. So the first speech compression, digital speech compression, was done in 1942 by someone called Ralph LaRue Miller, who later became my supervisor. And that's how I started in the same work, which, as I said a moment ago, led to the speech compression that we see today in cell phones and internet.
And so, how did you came back to acoustics? Because this took you out of acoustics.
Yeah, this was speech. This was not room acoustics. How did I come back? A very simple answer, namely, about 1960, uh, uh, AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph Company, and Bell Laboratories, where I worked, became more and more interested in conference telephony. In other words, people are at a conference table here and in some distant place with microphones on the table and loudspeakers. And the moment you talk about conference telephony, um, then you're talking about room acoustics. Suddenly the room becomes important for the telephone communication. If it's not with a handset, but if it's with microphones on the table. So, since I was by that time in charge of acoustics already, uh, I came back to my old field of room acoustics. That's how I got back, because AT&T was interested in conference telephony.
Professor, can you tell us a few words about your predecessors in room acoustics in America? I mean, Sabine and Ehring. What is your opinion on their work?
Well, of course, Eyring and Sabine are great names. Sabine is considered the father of room acoustics. He did a lecture hall at Harvard University, which had very poor acoustics, and also a concert hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he became famous by this. He invented the first formula for reverberation time, and he measured it. But he measured it by seating himself in a barrel with only his head sticking out, and then an organ was sounded, and he measured with a stopwatch how long he could hear the sound. That was the first measurement of reverberation time by Sabin. And then Eyring, but the formula he had was not exact. And so Eyring, some 20, 30 years later, came up with a better formula. So that's why Eyring became also famous in room acoustics.
And when you started to work on room acoustics, did you use Eyring formula?
I used these formulas in the sense by computer we simulated uh, sound propagation in rooms together with ATAL, ATAL, and we discovered by this computer simulation of reverberation that these formulas by Sabin and Eyring were wrong. So in that sense, I showed the people who had problems with the concert hall reverberation time that they were using a formula that was not correct. They didn't know it, but that's so my contribution,
Yes.
negative, you might say.
But when you came back to room acoustics, we are in 1960. So you are not working with Atal at this moment.
Yeah.
Atal you've been working with
Atal
Atal
came in 1962.
62.
About, yeah. So he joined me um, um, 2 years, or actually, I did the first simulation of concert hall acoustics on a large digital computer, IBM computer, at Bell Laboratories in 1958. So I was one of the first, I was in fact the first, who recreated concert halls on the computer. And one of the very first to use the computer for things other than number crunching. I mean, computers could well, calculate all kinds of things then, and they could draw simple graphs, but nobody had used the computer to simulate concert halls. And nobody then had used the computer to create pictures, computer graphics. That came around 1962.
And how did you get into this problem of modelizing, simulating a room inside a computer in 1958?
Well, had mentioned before this theory that I did for the sound transmission in large rooms. And this theory contains some mathematical approximations. And to check my own work as a student, I simulated this on the computer and let the computer run for a whole weekend at $600 an hour. Then I let the computer run whole weekends, and it ran so long nobody knew how long it ran. It was turned on Friday afternoon, and then on Monday morning the computer had stopped because something had broken down, and nobody knew how long it was. But money was not a question. So I used the computer to simulate certain aspects of sound transmission in large rooms to check my own theory. That's how I got into this.
Can you tell me more about this theory of the sound transmission in large rooms?
Yeah. Originally, the thought among room acoustic was that the sound transmission was one resonance of the room to the next. So the peaks in the frequency response should be equal to the number of resonances. Then, as some friends here at Göttingen, Kuthoff and Thiele, made measurements in a large hall in Munich called Herkulessaal in Munich, and discovered that the number of peaks was 1,000 times smaller than the number of resonances. So something was wrong with this theory. And then I made a mathematical theory where I said, look, the different modes in a large room interfere with each other randomly, and the result is an approximation to a Gaussian process, what's called a Gaussian random process. And this theory is still valid. I showed as a student that sound transmission in a large room above a certain frequency, which is now called the Schroeder frequency. Above that frequency, sound transmission in rooms is a completely random process and has nothing to do with the quality of the room. The acoustic quality of a concert hall is governed by other things, but not as people thought in 1955 by the frequency response. I showed as a student, and later confirmed by computer experiments, that this aspect of concert hall acoustics is completely random.
So let's go to this cutoff frequency. It's something with 2000 and reverberation time and something like that. And after that, you say that there is less than 3 dB between the peaks and the but so the idea that lies under this theory is that if you have one mode active, it would interfere and generate some other lobes, some other modes.
Well, if you put just a single tone, a single note into a large acoustic space like a concert hall, it excites typically not one resonance, but about 1,000 resonances. And they all interfere randomly. This was the basic idea which I proposed as a student here in Göttingen, and which is still true and still recognized. And what I just said is true only above a certain critical frequency called, as I said, the Schroeder frequency.
Absolutely. And how did you do you get to this frequency? There is very few lines about this. I have been searching
Yeah,
around.
how? Well, I was always interested in statistics. And so even in my second semester as a student here in Göttingen, I uh, participated in a course on statistical theory. So as opposed to most other students of physics or even mathematics, already after 1 year here, I knew a lot about statistics. So I immediately saw that this problem in room acoustics was a statistical problem.
And what is the idea that leads to you to the Schroeder cut frequency?
Okay, there was a certain theory by the American mathematician at Bell Laboratories, Steve Rice, who had made a theory of noise on electrical lines. And I immediately saw that this theory, or noise theory of Rice, would apply to the random interference of resonances in concert halls.
Okay. So now we are back in the 60s. You are doing some simulation of the rooms, the concert, the acoustic rooms
Yes.
for conference. And then what? So you have been working on this for a long time. How did you come from the conference room to the acoustic to the concert hall?
Well, I mean, um, I don't quite understand the question. I mean,
Well,
how?
you have been writing some interesting paper over the, the way a concert hall should be designed to please the audience.
Yes.
How do you come from conference over the phone, working for Bell Laboratories, to this very interesting and very concise paper
Yeah.
on the
Okay, there's a very simple answer to that. First of all, I said that I had to I started working again in um, room acoustics because the American Telephone and Telegraph Company was interested in conference telephony. But then in 1962, September 1962, a new concert hall was opened in New York at Lincoln Center, Philharmonic Hall. The conductor was Leonard Bernstein, and the first lady of the realm, namely Jacqueline Kennedy, was present. The president, of course, was busy with something else. I don't know what. And right from the very beginning, it was clear that this Philharmonic Hall was very deficient in acoustics. It had bad acoustics. So the music critic of the New York Times, Harold Schoenberg, and everybody agreed that this acoustics is bad. So Lincoln Center turned to the American Telephone and Telegraph Company for help. And the American Telephone and Telegraph Company turned to Bell Laboratories for help. And Bell Laboratories turned to the man in charge of acoustics, namely me, for help. So this Lincoln Center problem ended in my lap in early 1963. A committee of 4 acoustical scientists was formed under the chairmanship of Vern Knudsen, Chancellor of the University of California at Los Angeles, and Kyle Holz, a German acoustician, and another acoustician from Los Angeles, and myself. Now, I said I cannot make any recommendations for improving the acoustics because in 1956 the American Telephone and Telegraph Company had entered into an agreement with the United States government that restricted its business to the telephone, to printing telephone books, including yellow pages, to doing military research work and to sell at cost an artificial larynx for people who had lost their larynxes. So we were certainly, as a member of Bell Laboratories, I was not allowed to do any acoustic consulting. And that is actually a good idea. I mean, a big company like AT&T could ruin so many small companies. So we were. So I said, I will be glad to do all the measurements in Philharmonic Hall in New York, but I cannot make by law, by agreement with the government, any recommendation. So everybody agreed that I then took charge of measuring Philharmonic Hall together with Atal Sessler and James West. We made these measurements in Philharmonic Hall and analyzed the problems acoustically, physically, as opposed to judging the hall subjectively by listening to music. We wanted to know what are the physical, not subjective, but the objective properties of Philharmonic Hall. That's how I got into concert hall, back into concert hall acoustics.
Okay, before telling the conclusion of this measurement and the recommendations of your colleagues, could you tell me who was in charge of the conception of the Lincoln Center acoustically?
Okay, the money, of course, came
Before that,
from Rockefeller and so forth, and the original design was done by my good friend and famous acoustician Leo Beranek. Leo Beranek was the acoustic consultant of the original Philharmonic Hall. And he had had great success with the Tanglewood Music Shed with overhead reflectors. Very successful, very good acoustic. So he did a similar thing in a Philharmonic Hall in New York with overhead reflectors, but it didn't work in New York. So they went to these four consultants for other people that I mentioned a moment ago.
okay. And so you are making the measurements. What kind of measurement are you performing, and what are the recommendations that follows that measurement?
Well, we used the occasion to develop computer methods to analyze concert halls. In other words, we produced the test tones on the computer, and what we recorded at different sheets in these concert halls was analyzed on the computer. So we measured the sound transmission from the stage. We could separate the sound transmission directly from the stage and the sound transmission via the acoustic reflectors on the ceiling, and thereby could show that these acoustic reflectors up there are deficient. They were too small. They could not reflect the low frequencies, and that was one of the complaints in Philharmonic Hall. The transmission in the hall lacked low frequencies, bass notes, or as George Sell, a famous conductor from the Cleveland Orchestra, said, Philharmonic Hall is like a movie theater, a silent movie theater. In other words, and it was true that during tutti passages, when all the instruments played, you couldn't hear the cello. Why? The low frequency, of around 200 hertz, of the cello, the low notes, were completely wiped out. The technical term is they were masked by the sound from the other instruments. And we were able, by these computer analyses, to attribute the problem to the ceiling. And the ceiling was then replaced by something more solid.
Okay, so this is what you have been doing during the second half of the 60s.
Yeah.
Now we are entering the
The
70s.
1960s, yes.
Yes, in 60s.
Yeah.
And so, and after this room acoustic, the acoustic hall job, you are back to telephone business.
Yes, yes, we did some very important work, Atal and I, mostly on speech compression, which I said before, now makes handies possible. and make speech compression like Skype and so forth over the internet possible. Yes, I was back into my main work of speech compression, and but then in 1969 I got a call to become a professor of physics at Göttingen,
Okay,
and
but just before we are arriving to Göttingen, let's tell me a little more about the speech compression because after that I'm not sure we'll be back on it. Do you think that the codecs, because we are talking about codecs,
yeah.
have been improved very much, or uh, what was your compression ratio and what was your tricks? What was your approach to voice?
For the compression of speech.
Yes.
Well, the main idea was what is became soon known as linear prediction. In other words, I already knew that something like this was done in picture compression. You predict each point in a picture from the point just before it, from the line just before it, and from the frame just before it. So I said, let's do the same thing for speech, and Atal and I talked about it, and then we developed what became known as linear prediction of speech, LPC, where we look at a speech signal and predict the next value of the speech wave from the past of the speech signal. And now, of course, the actual speech signal is not exactly what you predict. There is a so-called prediction error. But what you have to transmit is not the speech signal itself, but only the prediction error. And that takes 1/10 or 1/40th of the bits. So you can compress it, the speech signal for digital transmission, 10 or even 40 times. And that's how we did it, and that was what was so successful.
And do you, today, have you been looking on the evolution of the voice compression? Are they still using it in
Yeah.
Skype and things?
Um, well, I can tell you one thing. After I left Bell Laboratories, but my group then worked on using these methods for the compression of music signals as used in MP3 and so forth. And they were very successful. This is not my work, but based on my work that was done after I had left Bell Laboratories. And Bell Laboratories, now a French company called Alcatel-Lucent, Bell Laboratories, had some patents which they believed that Microsoft had infringed, violated. So they took Alcatel-Lucent, took Microsoft to court. This was a year or so ago, less than a year ago, and won. And the judge awarded Bell Laboratories $1.52 billion that Microsoft had to pay Bell Laboratories for the violating the patent on music compression as used for MP3 and so forth. Now, of course, Microsoft will go into revision, will fight this. Although I guess Microsoft is rich enough they could pay $1.5 billion. But they will fight it, I think. But for the time being, as we talk today, there is this judgment that Microsoft has to owe, Microsoft owes Bell Laboratories, Alcatel-Lucent, $1.5 billion. So that's how important this business has become.
How did you? How did you get the idea? You are worldly famous. I'm on another subject now. You are worldly famous for your diffuser
Yeah,
in acoustic room
yes.
acoustic. Everybody says, "Oh, this is a Schroeder. Oh, you have a Schroeder. Don't you have a Schroeder? You need a Schroeder."
Yeah.
Okay, so it's almost a common word. How did you get the idea of?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When I came back to Göttingen, um, I asked the German Science Foundation, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, to support some research work on concert halls, which they did, and two later more of my students got their PhDs in analyzing 22 concert halls in Europe and the USA. And the main result of this study, taking several years, was that in modern concert halls there is not enough sound from the sides. Most of the sound in a modern concert hall comes from the front. Why? Because it's wide and fan-shaped, it has a low ceiling, so most of the sound is the direct sound from the front and the sound from the ceiling, also coming from the same direction. And this, we showed, is the main reason why so many, especially modern concert halls, have a bad acoustics. So how can we improve this? We cannot go back to the old um, architecture that we see in Vienna, Vienna Musikvereinssaal, where you have a narrow hall with a high ceiling. Nobody would build a concert hall like that anymore. And so I asked myself how to have good acoustics in a modern hall with a modern shape. And well, I said, let's leave the ceiling out, but then if it rains, it's no good. Then I thought, well, we should have a ceiling that disperses the sound, diffuses the sound over a very wide range, so then it comes to your ears from the side, as in a stereophonic recording, as opposed to a monophonic recording. But then I invented a certain kind of number theoretic surface, a kind of surface structure that comes from number theory that does this kind of sound diffusion, but does it only for one frequency. And then took me more than a year to discover surface structures that would diffuse the sound over many musical octaves. And I got the idea in 1977 doing a talk by André Weil, a French mathematician, in Göttingen on the occasion of the 200th birthday of Carl Friedrich Gauss. And he gave a talk on Gauss sums and quadratic residues. And during this talk by André Weil, I saw my ceilings must be structured according to Gauss and quadratic residues. And these have become the famous quadratic residue diffusers that everybody is using now. It happened, I know the precise moment, during a talk by André Weil.
Okay, so it was subsequent to the study. Now I'm back on the study of your two students. But before that, perhaps we can start with when did you come back to Göttingen, and how did the idea come in how did you get the idea of coming back to Göttingen?
Well, I was very happy at Bell Laboratories, but already in 1966 I had invited a physicist from Göttingen to work at Bell Laboratories for 3 months. And during this visit, he asked me, would I be receptive to an offer from the University of Göttingen to become a professor of physics here and succeed my predecessor as the director of the Third Physics Institute. And I really didn't know. But I thought I cannot possibly say I'm not interested. That would be impolite. So out of sheer politeness, politesse, politesse oblige, I said, yes, I'm interested. Now, a year or two later, when they actually made an offer, I said, well, maybe it would be a good idea. By then I had been 15 years at Bell Laboratories. I could have moved up in the administration, and I was not interested in administration, but I was interested in teaching, having students to work with. And so I accepted the offer, and I accepted the offer gladly, and I'm very glad I I accepted the offer to return to Göttingen as a. I made two good decisions in my life. One in 1954 to go to America, and two in 1969 to come back to Germany. My two best decisions.
So when you came back, you start teaching, and you when did you do this famous study of the whole European and American concert halls?
Well, immediately after I came back, already in 1970, I petitioned the German Science Foundation, and this work may have started, let's say, in 1971, 71, 72, 73, approximately.
And so,
But now I remember my first student, Dieter Gottlob.
excuse me, stop. Okay, we have a problem.